Ice filmed the river like a second skin, thin enough to shiver, thick enough to hiss when it scraped the stones. Dawn hadn't warmed anything. It only made the cold visible, steam lifting off black water, frost feathering the willow roots, breath hanging in the air as if it didn't want to leave. Mara had 1 minute, maybe less, before her fingers stopped doing what her mind told them. Ellis knelt at the bank with a mason's hammer and a pry bar, studying the limestone seam as if it were a map. The cliff face rose out of the floodplain in a pale curve, and halfway up it, just above the splash line, a dark notch cut inward. A shallow cave, no more than a shadow from the outside. From inside, it felt like a mouth. "Higher than the spring marks," Ellis said. His words came out tight, clipped by the cold. He pointed to a faint band of silt stained on the rock, last year's high water. The notch sat a good 0.7 meters above it, enough margin if the river swelled again. Mara tried to picture the settlement's main street in 2 months. Cabins leaking smoke, kids coughing, men arguing over who'd cut whose trees. Everyone talked like winter was a problem you solved with an axe. She'd seen winters outlast bravado. Behind them, on the cart track, hoofbeats approached. The sound carried oddly in the cold, sharp, brittle, as if the air was glass. A rider from town slowed, reined in, and stared down at them from the saddle like he was looking at a pair of people kneeling at their own grave. "You two still at it?" the man called. His beard was rimed with frost, and his eyes were bright with the satisfaction of being warm inside a coat. "Heard you're moving into that rat hole. Folks taking bets on how long you last." Ellis didn't look up. He pressed the pry bar into a crack and leaned. The rock gave a sound like a dull bell. Mara forced her hands to keep working, untying the bundle of stakes, laying them in a row so she could feel purposeful. "It's not a hole," she said. "It's stone walls already paid for." The rider snorted. "Stone walls don't make a home. Smoke'll choke you, damp'll rot you. And what, you'll pray the river keeps you warm?" Mara's mouth tasted metallic, the way it did when she was scared and refused to show it. "We won't be burning river water," she said. "We'll be burning less wood. That's the point." "Less wood," the rider echoed, as if she'd confessed to a crime. "That's not how a decent household runs. You want heat, you cut. You want food, you hunt. You want light, you spend tallow. Anything else is tricks." Tricks. That was the word they used when someone refused to suffer in the proper way. Ellis finally looked up, and for a moment Mara saw the calculation behind his eyes. Measurements, angles, the memory of a mill he'd once repaired upriver. "We can do better than tricks," he said. "We can do work once, and let it keep working." The rider's gaze slid to the notch in the rock. "Work once," he muttered. "You're saying the rock will cook your supper and tuck you in?" Mara stepped closer to the cave entrance. The wind died as she crossed the threshold, like someone shutting a door behind her. Inside, the air wasn't warm, but it was still enough that her breath didn't rip away. The stone held yesterday's faint, stubborn chill, yet it didn't bite like the open bank. It felt steady. Outside was a knife. Inside was a dull, heavy hand. That contrast was the whole reason she'd convinced Ellis to walk this stretch of river in the first place. The settlement sat on the exposed flats, pretty when the sun shone, and cruel when the wind came down from the north. Every cabin had 4 thin walls and a stove that demanded tribute. The cave offered thickness, mass, time, but it would also demand thought. If they did it wrong, it would kill them quietly. Smoke pooling at the ceiling, moisture slicking the floor, a blocked exit after a collapse. Ellis followed her in, shoulders hunched as if the stone might judge him. He held up a lantern and let its weak flame test the space. The cave ran back farther than it looked, about 9 meters to a narrowing bend, ceiling high enough to stand without stooping, floor sloping slightly toward the entrance. "Drainage," Mara said immediately, crouching to touch the dirt. It was sandy near the mouth, darker farther back. If meltwater runs in, we need a channel, or a sump. Ellis nodded. And a door, not just a blanket, a real door, sealed. Outside, the rider laughed, though the sound carried in like a taunt. Hear yourselves? Door for a bear den. You'll be the talk of Sunday. Mara turned and looked out at him, framed by pale daylight. Let them talk, she said. Talking doesn't keep your children's toes from turning black. For a heartbeat, the rider's smile faltered. He didn't like that image. No one did. But pride recovered quickly, the way it always did when it was safer than admitting fear. You'll come crawling back, he said, and kicked his horse forward. Hooves clattered over frozen stones. When your damp cave eats your lungs. When he was gone, the river sound filled the silence again, water pushing under ice, stubborn and constant. Mara listened to it like a promise and a threat at once. Ellis set the lantern on a flat rock and rubbed his hands together hard enough to make them sting. He's not entirely wrong, he said quietly. A cave can kill you. Smoke, damp, sickness. Mara swallowed. The cold had numbed her face, but not the ache behind her ribs. Then we make it not a cave, she said. We make it a house that happens to be inside stone. Ellis's eyes flicked to the ceiling, tracing lines only he seemed to see. We'll need air that moves, he said. A draft that pulls smoke out without pulling all the heat with it. And we need power, Mara added, surprising even herself with how certain it sounded. The word felt bold in a place where most people counted power in cords of wood and the strength of a back. Not just to be clever, to be independent. Ellis's mouth tightened at the corners, the look he got when an idea found a purchase. The river gives us motion, he said, if we can take it. Mara looked back toward the entrance. The ice on the waterline trembled and clicked, as if the river were laughing too, laughing at anyone who thought they could bargain with winter. She pulled her scarf higher and forced her fingers to work again. Stakes, twine, marks on stone. They measured the floor slope with a weighted string and scratched a line where a shallow trench could run. They checked the ceiling for loose plates and tapped until the rock answered solid. They counted the distance to the nearest straight-trunk cottonwoods they could legally fell. 240 paces, maybe 260, depending on how you walked it. Every decision was a chain. If the trench was too shallow, water would creep under their bedding. If the door didn't seal, wind would turn the cave into a tunnel. If the vent was wrong, the cave would fill with invisible death. By mid-morning, Mara's toes burned with returning feeling, the kind that made her want to scream. Ellis's knuckles were raw from limestone grit. The work hadn't warmed them, not really. It had only kept terror from settling. From the ridge above, distant voices drifted. Someone shouting in town, the faint clank of a saw, life continuing in its familiar pattern. Mara imagined those same voices, weeks from now, when the woodpiles shrank and the wind sharpened, and the bravest men in the settlement started counting nails they could pull from boards to burn. Ellis crouched by the cave mouth and drew in the dirt with the tip of his knife. A circle for a wheel, a line for a shaft, a box for a grinding stone. We'll set the wheel just below the shelf, he murmured, almost to himself. Undershot. The current's fast enough here even in low water. If it ices, we cut a channel. Mara stared at the sketch until it became more than scratches. She saw flour dusting her hands. She saw a lamp that didn't drink their tallow. She saw warmth that didn't vanish the moment a fire died. And she saw the settlement's faces when the river froze their pride solid. Ellis looked up at her. If we start today, we can have the door hung before the first deep snow, he said. But once we commit, there's no halfway. People won't help. Mara listened to the river again, to the relentless shove of water under ice. Then we don't build for their help, she said. We build for their laughter. Ellis exhaled, and in that breath, Mara heard his fear turning into resolve. He stood, lifted the lantern, and stepped deeper into the cave like a man entering an argument he intended to win. Outside, the wind scraped the bank clean of any illusion of mercy. Inside, the stone waited, cold, heavy, and patient, as if it had been holding its breath for someone stubborn enough to ask it to shelter life. By the third day, the settlement had given their project a name, the way people named things they didn't want to understand. River rats, a woman called from the mercantile porch, as Mara shouldered a sack of nails. The word carried across the packed snow like a thrown pebble. A few men laughed into their mittens, careful not to laugh too hard in case hunger overheard them. Mara didn't stop walking. She'd learned that if you argued with mockery, you fed it. If you ignored it, you starved it, slowly, stubbornly, the way winter starved anything careless. Ellis waited by the cart outside, stamping his boots to keep blood in his feet. "Get the hinges?" he asked. "And tarred canvas," Mara said, lifting the bundle so he could see. "Old shipcloth. The trader wanted an extra dime because he said we'd waste it on nonsense." Ellis's jaw flexed. He loaded the supplies without looking back at the porch. The mercantile owner, Reverend Holt's cousin, as everyone liked to mention, stood with his hands tucked into his coat sleeves, expression pious as a hymn. In town, disapproval often wore a clean face. At the riverbank, the cave mouth looked smaller with snow piled against its lip, as if the land itself tried to close it. The first thing Mara did was shove her arm into the dark and feel for the air. Still. No smell of rot, no sharpness of bats, just stone and damp earth. They started with the part no one would praise: water. Ellis drove a sharpened stake into the cave floor near the back wall and tied a string line to it, stretching the line toward the entrance with a small stone hanging from the center. The plumb bob kissed the dirt. "Floor pitches toward the mouth," he said. "But not enough. Meltwater will pool back there." Mara knelt and scraped with her knife, following the line. "We cut a trench," she said. "Shallow, wide. If it's deep, we'll trip at night." Ellis nodded. He'd already thought that far. He always did. He dug with a short spade, carving a channel about 12 centimeters deep and a handspan wide, running along the wall where bedding wouldn't go. Every few feet they tested the grade with water from a tin cup. Pour, watch, adjust. When the trickle finally slid on its own toward daylight, Mara felt the first real relief she'd had since choosing this place. Then came air. A cave could be a jar. A stove inside a jar meant carbon monoxide. Death without drama. Ellis marked 2 points with charcoal. One low near the future stove site, one high near the ceiling toward the back bend. "We need a path," he said, "but we can't just punch a hole and hope." Mara pictured the town's cabins with their stovepipes sticking up like black fingers. "They think smoke going straight up is the only way," she said. "It's the easiest way," Ellis replied. "Not always the best." He explained while he worked, not like a teacher, but like a man arguing with the material in front of him. If the exhaust went out through a high vent, the warm smoke would rise naturally, but only if fresh air could enter somewhere else. Without a controlled inlet, the fire would steal oxygen from the room and pull drafts through cracks. Cold drafts, wet drafts, drafts that made a place miserable. With an inlet low and near the stove, the fire would drink outside air first, and the rest of the cave could stay calmer. So they drilled a small intake hole through a softer seam near the cave mouth, small enough to control, large enough to breathe. Ellis lined it with a short length of hollowed elder pipe, then packed clay around it to keep critters out. Over the inner end, Mara fitted a sliding wooden shutter she could open with numb fingers. The exhaust took longer. The back of the cave curved upward into a tight crack that disappeared into the rock. Ellis climbed onto a flat slab and pressed his ear to the stone. "Hollow," he murmured. There's a fissure behind here. Mara's stomach tightened. Hollows could be blessings or collapses. Will it hold? She asked. It's old, he said. Settled, but we'll support it anyway. They cut 3 stout posts from pine and wedged them under a natural ledge, making a crude frame. Then Ellis chipped away at the fissure, widening it just enough to accept a clay-lined flue they formed from river mud mixed with chopped straw. The work was slow, the kind of slow that made doubt feel reasonable. Each strike of hammer against rock echoed like a warning. When the flue finally met open air, Ellis confirmed it by holding a lantern near the opening and watching the flame lean. Mara exhaled hard. A path. A controlled path. The cave was no longer a sealed mouth. It had a throat. The door came next, and with it the most visible piece of their defiance. Ellis built the frame from squared timbers, anchoring it into drilled holes with wooden pegs. Mara packed the gaps with moss and clay. They hung the planks on iron hinges, then stretched the tarred canvas across the inner face like a second skin. When the door shut, it shut with a heavy sound, not a flap. Thunk, like a chest closing on stored goods. Outside, the wind tried to push in and failed. The first time Mara stood inside with the door closed, her ears rang with the sudden quiet. She held her lantern up and watched the flame. It steadied instead of guttering. The cave didn't feel warm yet, but it felt defensible. That evening, Ellis lit a small test fire in a stone ring they'd built near the intake. He fed it 2 thin sticks and watched the smoke. For a tense moment it hung low, curling like a snake searching for a bite. "Come on," Mara whispered, not sure if she was talking to the smoke or to fate. Ellis opened the intake shutter a finger's width. The fire brightened. The smoke lifted, found the high flue, and began to climb. It didn't vanish instantly. It never would. But it moved with purpose, drawn like breath. Ellis's shoulders loosened, as if someone had cut a rope. "It pulls," he said. Mara leaned back against the stone wall. It was cold through her coat, but it didn't shift, didn't creak, didn't complain. The rock had been here longer than any rumor in town. It would outlast their ridicule, too. Outside, across the river flats, lights winked on in cabin windows, tallow lamps burning their small, expensive hours. Mara watched them through the crack at the door and thought of the woodpiles stacked beside those cabins like promises. Promises could run out. The river, on the other hand, kept moving under its thin armor of ice, patient as a machine. And now their cave had drainage to shed water, vents to shed smoke, and a door that could shut winter out. Not a home yet, Mara thought, but no longer a hole. Ellis didn't start with the wheel. He started with a stick. Mara watched him kneel at the river's edge, holding a straight willow wand over the current, timing how long a floating chip took to pass between 2 stones. He counted under his breath, lips barely moving. Then he did it again, and again, as if the river might change its mind if he didn't look serious enough. "What's the verdict?" Mara asked, blowing on her hands. The air smelled like iron and wet rock. "Fast," Ellis said. "Fast enough to be worth our trouble. Not fast enough to forgive bad design." He marked 2 points on the bank with stones, paced the distance. 18 feet, then scratched numbers into a slat of wood with his knife. Mara couldn't read all of it, but she could read the shape of his concentration. He was building the wheel in his head before he cut a single board. They'd scavenged what they could without begging. A broken wagon rim, a length of chain from a discarded harrow, oak planks traded for with 2 jars of Mara's pickled turnips, and an apology she didn't offer out loud. Iron spikes Ellis had pulled from an abandoned ferry landing upriver, each one bent and straightened like a stubborn nail refusing to die. The settlement called that making do, but only when it looked familiar. When it looked like invention, they called it pride. The wheel needed a place to live. Ellis chose a notch in the bank just downstream of the cave, where the current pinched between 2 boulders and sped up with a sound like tearing cloth. He drove 2 heavy posts into the gravel bed, bracing them with angled struts. The work was wet and punishing. The river numbed his calves through his boots until he had to climb out and stomp, feeling back into his legs. Mara kept the fire inside the cave small but steady, a thin line of warmth for when Ellis stumbled in shivering. She hated how quickly cold could turn a strong man clumsy. When the posts finally stood, Ellis set a crossbeam between them, oak, squared with an adze, heavy enough that it took both of them grunting together to lift it. He drilled a hole through the beam with a hand auger, the spiral squealing in wood like a trapped animal. Through that hole would go the axle. They built the axle from a straight pine log, peeled and smoothed, with iron collars hammered onto each end to prevent splitting. Ellis heated the collars in the stove until they glowed dull red, then slid them onto the wood and quenched them with river water. The metal shrank tight with a hiss. Mara flinched at the sound. It felt like sealing a promise. The wheel itself came last, and it was the part that would make them a laughingstock if it failed. Ellis laid the wagon rim on the ground and used it as a guide, tracing a circle onto planks. He cut 12 arms, spokes, each notched at one end to fit the axle hub. For the hub, he used a thick oak block, bored through the center, then split and clamped with iron banding so it could be tightened around the axle. Mara held pieces steady while Ellis worked, her fingers numb, her mind counting risks. If the wheel wobbled, it would chew itself apart. If it spun too fast, the bearings would burn. If it spun too slow, the millstone would never turn. They fashioned the bearings from hardwood blocks, soaked in rendered fat, a crude lubrication that smelled faintly like cooking. Ellis insisted on a way to add grease without dismantling everything, so he drilled small holes and carved channels, then plugged them with whittled pegs. Maintenance, he said, as if the word were a prayer. Everything fails without it. By the time they raised the wheel frame, the sky had turned the color of old tin. Snow threatened in the west, low and heavy. Mara felt the pressure of time like a weight on her neck. If they didn't get power before the real cold settled, their cleverness would be nothing but frozen tools. They carried the assembled wheel, half lashed, half prayed, down to the posts. Ellis guided the axle ends into the bearing blocks. Mara wedged shims of leather under one side to level it. The wheel hung there, still and ridiculous, like a child's toy built too big. Ellis stepped back, breathing hard. "Moment of truth," he said. Mara's stomach tightened. She could already hear the settlement's laughter if it sat dead in the water. Ellis the tinkerer, Mara the fool, both of them shivering in a cave with nothing but a pile of damp wood and a broken dream. Ellis waded out, braced his hands against a paddle, and shoved the wheel toward the current. For a second, nothing happened. The river slid past, as if the wheel were invisible. Then the first paddle caught. The wheel jerked. Wood creaked. A chain link snapped tight. The current grabbed the next paddle and the next, and suddenly the circle began to move. Slow at first, then steadier, water slapping the boards in a rhythm that sounded like footsteps. Thump, splash, thump. Mara laughed once, sharp and surprised, and clamped a hand over her mouth as if laughter might jinx it. Ellis's face didn't soften into a grin right away. He watched like a man waiting for betrayal. The wheel made a full rotation, then another. Ellis reached for the chain drive they'd rigged, a loop running from a sprocket pinned to the axle toward the cave wall, where they'd mounted a crude pulley. The chain rattled, but it moved. The pulley turned. Inside the cave, the belt they'd cut from thick leather twitched and began to slide. "Come see," Ellis called, voice strained with hope he didn't want to name. Mara ran into the cave, lantern swinging. In the back, on a stout bench, they'd mounted a hand millstone scavenged from an old grinding set. 2 circular stones, the top one meant to spin. Ellis had carved a wooden shaft up through the center and fitted it with a simple gear, teeth cut by hand, imperfect but eager. The shaft trembled. The gear clicked, the top stone shuddered, and began to turn, not fast, not smooth, but turning. Mara put her palm lightly on the stone's edge and felt the vibration of the river translated through wood and iron and stubborn human will. Outside, water fell against paddles. Inside, the stone answered. Ellis came in behind her, dripping river water onto the floor. "If we keep the gearing gentle, we can grind without cracking the stone," he said, already adjusting, already improving. "We'll add a flywheel to smooth it. Maybe a bigger pulley ratio." Mara turned to him, and for the first time since they'd chosen the cave, she saw something like safety on his face. Not comfort. Comfort was for later, but the knowledge that their system could produce something essential. Flour meant bread. Bread meant days. Outside, as if to test them, the wind rose and drove sleet against the door. The settlement would be shutting windows, feeding stoves, burning wood as if it were endless. In the cave, the wheel kept walking in its circle, steady as a heartbeat. And somewhere in town, Mara knew, someone would hear the faint, strange sound carried over the flats, the slap of paddles, the clatter of chain, and wonder what kind of rat hole made that noise. 2 days after the wheel began turning the millstone, Mara brought a sack of coarse flour into town. She didn't announce it. She didn't smile. She simply walked into the mercantile with snow on her shoulders and set the sack on the counter like a fact. The owner eyed it, then eyed her. "You buyin' or sellin'?" he asked, as if the answer might offend him either way. "Trading," Mara said. "For copper wire if you've got any. And lamp glass. Small." A man at the stove, Cal Darrow, the loudest sawyer in the settlement, laughed into his mug. "Lamp glass," he repeated. "Hear that? The cave folk want windows for their dirt." Mara turned her head just enough to let him see her face. Calm, tired, not pleading. "Not windows," she said. "A lamp chimney." Cal's grin widened. "For what lamp? You don't have tallow to waste, unless you're squeezing river grease now." The mercantile owner leaned on the counter. "Copper wire costs," he said. "And it's not for experiments." Ellis had warned her about this moment, the point where an idea became a threat, and gatekeepers tightened their fists around supplies. Mara untied the sack and dipped a wooden scoop in, lifting flour into the lamplight. It wasn't fine, it wasn't pretty, but it was food made without hours at a hand quern. The smell, grain and stone, rose warm against the cold air. "I'll trade you 3 pounds of this a week," Mara said, "until spring. You know what that's worth when the river trail closes." The owner hesitated. Hunger argued with pride on his face. Cal scoffed. "You can't grind that much by hand." "I'm not," Mara said. That was all she offered. She didn't explain the wheel. Explanation invited debate, and debate invited sabotage. Let them be curious on their own. The owner finally disappeared into the back and returned with a coil of copper wire and 2 soot-smudged lamp chimneys wrapped in cloth. "This is all I've got," he said sharply, "and don't come crying if you burn your den down." Mara slid the flour across. "If I burn," she said, "it'll be because the draft was wrong, not because the place is stone." Cal snorted again, but his eyes followed the wire as she took it. That was the first crack in his laughter. Attention. Back at the cave, Ellis unrolled the copper wire like it was gold. "Enough for coils," he said, voice low, "and enough for a run to a lamp." Mara set the lamp chimneys on the bench. "They think we're wasting it," she said. "Let them." Ellis's hands moved fast despite the cold. He'd been preparing for this, carving a wooden form, saving bits of iron, collecting flat stones to use as weights. The generator wasn't a mystery to him. It was a memory of a place he'd once worked, a sawmill where a belt had turned a little dynamo that powered the foreman's office light. He'd never forgotten the humiliation of being told he was only hired muscle, not a thinker. Now he built as if every nail was an argument. He shaped 2 semicircles of hardwood to hold a rotor shaft and mounted them on a frame bolted to the cave wall. On the shaft, he fixed a disc cut from plank, then embedded iron nails around its edge, all facing the same direction, their heads filed smooth. "Not true magnets," he admitted, "but if we wrap wire coils close, the changing field from iron passing near iron—" Mara raised a brow. "You're about to talk like a book." Ellis stopped, then redirected himself the way he always did when she pulled him back to the human part of things. "We spin metal past coils," he said simply, "and it makes a push. Enough for a small light if we don't waste it." He wrapped the copper wire into tight coils around carved wooden bobbins, counting turns aloud. 180 turns, then another coil, then another, so his hands didn't drift into sloppy work. He varnished the coils with pine resin thinned over heat so the wire wouldn't vibrate loose. The cave smelled sharp and sweet, like a forest set on a stove. To smooth the wheel's uneven motion, he made a flywheel from a flat river stone drilled through the center and strapped to the shaft with iron banding. It wasn't elegant. It was heavy. That was the point. The stone's inertia evened out each slap of water against a paddle. The first test nearly ended in disaster. Ellis tightened the belt from the wheel pulley to the generator shaft, then told Mara to open the intake shutter and keep the stove fire low. He wanted the cave air stable, no sudden drafts that might tug smoke back. Outside, the river ran black between jagged shelves of ice. "Ready?" he asked. Mara held the lantern close, but extinguished its flame so they'd see the difference. Darkness filled the cave, thick and immediate. Ellis signaled, and Mara cracked the door just enough to let the wheels sound in louder. The belt began to move. The generator shaft spun. The flywheel hummed. Then the belt slipped. It snapped sideways and whipped Ellis across the knuckles, hard enough to draw blood. He cursed, stumbling back. The wheel outside kept turning, but the belt flailed uselessly, slapping the frame like a snake. Mara seized it with a gloved hand, yanking it down and pinning it with her boot. "Stop!" she shouted. Ellis ran out and jammed a wedge into the wheel paddles, breaking it. The river fought him. He leaned his full weight into the wedge until the wheel shuddered to a halt. When he came back in, his face was pale beneath the grime, not from pain, from the realization that a spinning system didn't care if it hurt you. "We need a guard," Mara said, voice steady, "and a tensioner, something that keeps the belt aligned." Ellis nodded once, swallowing pride with blood. They rigged a simple idler pulley from a smooth branch wrapped in leather, mounted on a hinged arm with a stone weight hanging from it. The weight kept constant tension, letting the belt flex without jumping. Mara built a crude wooden shield over the moving parts, nailed tight, so no sleeve or hair could be caught. Only then did they try again. Darkness. The wheel's steady slap. The flywheel's deepening hum. Ellis held 2 bare wire ends to a small homemade lamp, a jar with a cork lid, a strip of cloth for a wick, and a thin filament of iron wire scavenged from a trap spring. He'd soaked the wick in rendered fat, but that was only to start the glow. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the filament blushed red, faint as an ember. Mara's throat tightened. It wasn't bright, not like day, but it was light that didn't consume their stored tallow, light that came from moving water and careful choices. The cave walls caught it and gave it back softly, as if the stone itself approved. Ellis's eyes glistened in the dim glow. He didn't speak. He just watched the red thread of heat, listening to the wheel outside like a drum. A knock sounded at the door, 3 sharp raps, impatient. Mara stiffened. "Who?" A familiar voice, muffled by canvas and cold. "Caldero. Heard you've got a mill running in there," he called. "That true? Or you just rattling chains to scare folks?" Mara looked at Ellis. The filament still glowed. Proof, fragile as a spider thread. Ellis wiped blood from his knuckles, then nodded toward the door. "Not yet," his eyes said. Not on our terms. Mara blew out the lantern completely and closed her hand around the glowing jar, shielding it. "Tell him nothing," she whispered. Outside, Cal knocked again, harder. "Open up. I want to see this river magic." Inside the cave, their little light burned steady, and Mara understood the next problem wasn't engineering. It was people. Mara didn't open the door for Cal. Not that night. She waited until his boots scuffed away, and the river was the only sound again. Then she let her breath out in one long thread. The cave felt smaller when someone wanted in. Ellis sat at the workbench, turning his injured hand under the red glow of the filament lamp, inspecting the welt like it was another mechanical failure to be diagnosed. "They'll come back," he said. "I know," Mara answered. "That's why we need more than a trick. We need something that doesn't depend on being awake to feed it." Ellis's gaze drifted to the stove, then to the walls. Thick limestone, damp, sweet, and unchanging. He'd been thinking along the same line. "Thermal mass," he said quietly. "We can make the stone do the night shift." In town, people treated heat like a fire you wrestled. You fed it until your eyes burned, then woke up at midnight to feed it again, because if you didn't, the cabin went cold like a coffin. Mara had lived that rhythm. It broke you slowly, one sleepless week at a time. The cave offered a different bargain. You could store warmth in the walls and floor, then let that stored heat leak back out gradually, not in a blaze, but in a steady, dull release. But only if they could charge it, without filling the place with smoke or damp. They started by moving the stove. Ellis had built it from a cast-iron box, traded off a trapper, patched with clay and wire. At first it sat near the center for convenience. Now he dragged it, scraping, grunting, closer to the back bend, where the stone wrapped around them thickest. "The deeper rock changes temperature slowest," he said. "If we warm that, it'll hold." Mara laid flat stones beneath it, creating a hearth platform to keep embers from finding dirt. Then she stacked more stones along the stove's sides, like a crude masonry jacket, leaving a gap for airflow. The goal wasn't to smother the stove. It was to make its heat pass into rock instead of racing straight into the air and out the flue. "Like wrapping a pot," Mara muttered. Ellis gave a tight smile. "Exactly, but the pot is the whole cave." They tested in careful steps. First, a small fire for 1 hour, intake shutter barely open, exhaust draft steady. Mara watched the smoke. She watched Ellis's face for dizziness, for the subtle signs of bad air. Every 10 minutes, she held the filament lamp near the ceiling and near the floor, checking if the glow shifted strangely. An old mill trick Ellis swore by, using the flame and the filament as crude indicators of stagnant air. After the first hour, the cave air felt almost the same, but the stones near the stove had lost their wet chill. Mara pressed her palm against them and felt a faint warmth that wasn't imagination. "Again," she said. They fed the stove harder in the afternoon, when both of them were awake and alert. Mara kept the door shut, but she opened the intake a touch more to give the fire outside air to drink. Ellis adjusted the flue damper, just a flat iron plate on a hinge, until the smoke pulled clean. By sunset, the stone behind the stove was warm enough to dry a damp glove. Mara hung a strip of cloth near the wall. It fluttered slightly toward the flue, proof the cave was breathing the way they'd designed it. Then they stopped feeding the fire. That was the part that made Mara's stomach twist. Stopping felt like surrender. In town, stopping meant cold by midnight. Here, they were betting on stored warmth, on slow physics instead of frantic labor. They ate in the dim red light, cornmeal mush thickened with their own flour, a scrap of salt pork shaved thin. Ellis kept glancing toward the stove, as if expecting it to scold him for neglect. Night settled hard. Wind found every gap in the riverbank and sang through it. Somewhere across the flats, a dog barked once and fell silent. Mara lay on their bedding, dry straw over canvas, over boards, listening. The wheel outside had slowed with rising ice, but it still turned, a faint slap in the darkness. The cave smelled of resin and stone, not smoke. That mattered. Smoke meant failure. Ellis's breathing steadied beside her. "How long?" he murmured. Mara checked the small thermometer Ellis had cobbled from a trader's broken instrument, its markings scratched, its glass fogged. At dusk, it had read 11C 11C near the sleeping area, cool but livable. Now, hours later, it read 9C 9C. In a cabin, the same night would have dropped to near freezing without fresh wood. "It's falling," she whispered, but slowly. Ellis exhaled, the sound almost a laugh. "Slow is everything." At midnight, Mara woke out of habit, heart thudding, expecting the familiar bite of cold. Instead, she felt not warm, but held. The air hadn't turned sharp. The stone beside her cheek was cool, but not cruel. The cave had become an animal that conserved its own heat. She rose and padded to the stove. Its iron was dark, no glow, no crackle. Yet when she placed her hand on the rock jacket, warmth seeped into her palm, gentle as bread fresh from an oven. She went back to the bedding and didn't wake Ellis. She wanted to let him sleep like a man who wasn't chained to a woodpile. In the morning, the thermometer read 7C 7C. Mara could see her breath faintly, but her fingers still worked. Ellis sat up, blinking, and realized he'd slept through the night. He stared at her like she'd performed a miracle. "We didn't feed it," he said. "No," Mara replied. "We fed the walls yesterday." Ellis swung his legs off the bedding and pressed his palm to the stone jacket, eyes narrowing as he felt the lingering warmth. "If we do this every afternoon," he said, "we can keep nights from killing us, and we'll burn less." Mara nodded, but her mind was already running forward. Less wood for them meant nothing if the town decided to punish them, by cutting them off from supplies, by spreading rumors, by claiming their cave was unholy or unsafe. As if summoned by her fear, voices drifted in from outside, 2 men walking the river trail, talking louder than they needed to. "Telling you, Holt says it ain't right," one voice said, "living under the earth like you're ashamed of God's sky." "And Darrow says they've got a light in there," the other replied, "red as an ember, says it's witchwork or a prank." Mara met Ellis's eyes. The cave held warmth in its bones. Their lamp held a thread of power. Their wheel held a promise of food. And now the settlement was deciding what story to tell about it. Ellis's jaw set. "Let them call it what they want," he said. "When their stoves go out, names won't matter." Mara listened to the voices fade downriver. The stone behind her radiated yesterday's work, slow and faithful. Outside, winter was tightening its grip. Inside, the cave was learning to keep its own heat. The first person to admit the wood was going wrong wasn't a man. It was a boy. He came to the riverbank in the late afternoon, walking fast like he wanted to outrun shame. His cheeks were raw from cold, and his mittens were mismatched, one wool, one leather. When he saw the water wheel turning, he slowed, mesmerized, then caught himself and glanced around as if the trees might gossip. Mara stepped out of the cave with a basket of split kindling in her arms. "You're Holt's?" she asked, recognizing the sharp nose and the stubborn jaw. The boy nodded once, throat working. "Ma says, Reverend says you shouldn't—" He swallowed the rest, eyes flicking to the door, to the faint reddish glow leaking at the seams. "But our stove went out last night." Mara's grip tightened on the basket. "Out?" He nodded again, more frantic. "Not broke. Just, we couldn't keep it. Pa's been cutting since before sunup. Wood's wet under the snow. The good stack's smaller than he said." The boy's voice cracked on the last words, betraying him. "Ma burned the last of the old crates." Ellis appeared behind Mara, wiping flour from his forearms. He looked at the boy the way he looked at a jammed gear. not with contempt, but with focus. "How many nights?" Ellis asked. The boy blinked. "What?" "How many nights can your family keep a fire going?" Ellis repeated, gentler. "If the wet wood stays wet?" The boy's lips parted. He didn't know. That was the truth. Town people measured everything until it mattered, then discovered they'd never counted. "Go home," Mara said softly. "Tell your mother to keep the stove small. Don't burn it hot. Hot wastes wood if your walls leak." The boy stared. You're telling me how to—" "I'm telling you not to die," Mara said. "There's a difference." He backed away, then turned and ran, boots crunching, shoulders hunched against wind. When he was gone, Ellis leaned close. "It's starting," he murmured. Mara watched the river trail toward town. Smoke hung over the settlement in a low, dirty layer. On calm days it rose clean, but now it clung, trapped under cold air like a lid. That meant everyone was burning constantly, and the sky couldn't even carry their effort away. 2 days later, Caldero came again, this time not with laughter, but with a tin cup in his hand and the careful posture of a man approaching a dog that might bite. He stopped outside the door and cleared his throat. "Mara," he called. He'd learned her name, which meant he'd been forced to say it. "Ellis, you got flour to trade?" Mara opened the door only a handspan, letting cold light slice into the cave. She didn't invite him in. "Depends," she said. "What have you got?" Cal lifted the tin cup. Inside, a few nails and a small spool of thin wire rattled. "This," he said, "and I'll throw in a lantern, glass intact. My wife says it's foolish to keep it if we can't feed it." Mara's eyes narrowed. "Can't feed it with what? Tallow?" Cal's mouth twitched, as if the word tasted bitter. "Wood," he admitted. "We've been burning more than we thought. The nights are longer. The winds worse." He looked past Mara into the cave, trying to see without appearing to. "Heard you folks don't burn much." Ellis came to stand beside Mara, visible in the door crack like a warning. "We burn smarter," he said. Cal's shoulders tensed. "Same thing," he muttered. Then louder, "Look, I ain't here to argue. I'm here because my youngest's coughing at night and the cabin's cold by morning. Folks in town are starting to—" He stopped himself before saying panic. Mara felt the shift, subtle but real. The laughter had carried certainty. This carried need. She took the wire and nails, weighed them in her palm. "Flour costs water wheel labor," she said, "and we're not your mill. We've got our own winter." Cal nodded quickly, almost too quickly. "Fair. How much?" £2, Mara said, "for that cup, and one favor." Cal blinked. "Favor?" Ellis spoke before Mara could. "You tell people the river didn't make this by magic," he said. "You tell them it's wood and stone and work. No devil, no witch, no shame." Cal's eyes darted. He didn't like being asked to stand against the town's story, but he liked the image of his child shivering even less. "Fine," he said too fast. "I'll tell 'em." Mara handed him the flour, watching his hands tremble as he took it. Hunger did that. Cold did that. It reduced pride to a thin coat that didn't fit anymore. After Cal left, more came. Not all at once, not in a line. Town people were still too proud for that. But a woman just happening by, with a sack of dried apples, asking if Mara would trade for ground meal. A man with a cracked axe head, offering it if Ellis could set it right, because the blacksmith's forge had gone cold twice in 1 week, and charcoal was running scarce. A teenager sent to ask if they had spare candle stubs, eyes down, cheeks flaming. Each visit brought new information, like bits of a map. Wood was wet. Wood was frozen. Wood was farther away than expected, because easy trees had been cut in earlier years. The river trail to the next settlement was glazing over with ice, making trade uncertain. The Sawyer's big pile, everyone's comfort, had been counted twice and measured wrong. The town had lived on a lie made of stacked logs and optimism. Mara and Ellis, without meaning to, were becoming a second lie in their minds, the lie that someone else had planned ahead. That terrified Mara more than the cold. One evening, Reverend Holt himself appeared near the wheel, black coat flapping like a crow's wing in the wind. He didn't step close to the water. He kept his boots on dry rock and watched the turning paddles with a face set in judgment. Ellis straightened from the mill bench, flour dust on his sleeves. Mara wiped her hands on her apron, feeling suddenly exposed. Holt didn't greet them. He looked at the cave mouth, then at the wheel, then back at their faces. "People say you've made your home in the earth," he said, voice carrying the weight of a sermon, even when spoken quietly, "and that you've drawn power from the river." Ellis didn't bow his head. "We've drawn work," he corrected. "Power's just work saved." Holt's lips tightened. "The town is anxious," he said. "They fear what they don't understand. They also fear scarcity." Mara heard it then, the soft admission hidden inside his righteousness. Fear. "We fear scarcity too," Mara said. "That's why we built." Holt's gaze sharpened. "And when others lack, will you share?" The question landed like a stone, because Mara knew what was coming next. Even if Holt didn't say it, the wood would run out. Not in spring, not in a month. Soon. And when it did, the settlement would look toward the only place that still had light and warm stone. Mara looked at Ellis, and Ellis looked at the wheel. Outside, the river kept moving, patient and cold. Inside, their system kept them fed and lit, but the town's hunger was turning their success into a target. The river froze in layers, not all at once. First came the lace, thin, bright sheets that formed overnight along the edges. Then the plates, opaque slabs that bumped and groaned against each other like animals shifting in a pen. Finally came the skin that tried to seal everything, leaving only a narrow, dark tongue of moving water in the center. Ellis watched it with the same expression he'd worn the day the belt whipped his knuckles, a man learning that nature didn't care how clever he felt. "The wheel's losing bite," he said. Mara stood beside him on the bank, boots planted on packed snow. The paddles still slapped, but the rhythm had changed. Slower, heavier, like a heart fighting sleep. Ice chunks nudged the wheel's lower boards, stealing momentum. "How long?" Mara asked. Ellis didn't answer immediately. He crouched, scooped a handful of river slush, and let it drain through his fingers. "If the current narrows to that center channel, we can redirect it," he said at last. "Cut a chute, keep flow under the paddles." "With what time?" Mara said. The wind stung her cheeks. "We've got food to grind, stone to charge, people knocking every day." Ellis's eyes flicked toward the trail. He'd been hearing the same knocks, the same careful, hungry voices. As if to prove her point, a figure appeared between the cottonwoods, moving unsteadily. Not a lone trader this time. A woman with a child bundled against her chest, and behind her, an older man carrying a bundle of bedding. Mara felt her stomach drop. "That's the Weaver family," she whispered. She recognized the woman's scarf, patched blue wool, and the way she leaned forward into the wind like she'd been doing it for days. They reached the wheel and stopped, breath ragged. "Please," the woman said without preface. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her lashes were clumped with ice. "Our stove." The pipe cracked. Smoke filled the room. "We got the little one out, but—" She swallowed hard, chin trembling. "My father can't take another night in the open." Behind her, the old man's lips were blue. His hands shook, as if he were trying to hold himself together by force. Ellis looked at Mara, and Mara felt the world narrow to a single decision. This was the point of no return. The river didn't announce with thunder. It arrived in the shape of a child's stiff fingers. If they opened the cave, it stopped being theirs. It became a promise. Promises could kill you if you couldn't keep them. But if they didn't open it— Mara stepped forward and took the child's bundled weight into her arms. The child was too light, too quiet. "Inside," Mara said. and didn't wait for Ellis to agree. Ellis moved automatically, unbarring the door, swinging it wide. Warm air, stored in stone, spilled out like a sigh. The weaver woman stumbled across the threshold and began to cry, not with noise, but with shoulders shaking, as if her body finally believed it might survive. Ellis ushered the old man in last, then shut the door fast, sealing wind out. The sudden quiet made the woman flinch. She'd grown used to winter screaming. Mara laid the child on their bedding and rubbed small feet through wool. "Stove's cold," she said to Ellis. "We charge the stone now. We do it hard while we're awake." Ellis hesitated, eyes darting to the vent, to the intake shutter, calculating risk. More people meant more breath, more moisture, more carbon dioxide. The cave's balance could tip. He nodded once. "We run a hotter burn," he said, "but we watch draft every minute." They fed the stove with split pieces, drier wood they'd saved for emergencies. Mara hated dipping into that reserve, but the emergency was breathing in her arms. Ellis opened the intake shutter wider and adjusted the damper until the smoke pulled clean. The flue drew steadily, but Mara noticed condensation forming faster along the cooler parts of the wall. Moisture beaded and ran. Too many bodies, she thought, and felt fear bloom. Ellis addressed it the only way he knew, with a modification. He took a spare length of elder pipe and fitted it into the intake, creating a second, smaller inlet near the floor on the opposite side of the stove. "Crossflow," he muttered, working quickly. "Fresh air comes low on one side, exits high at the flue, keeps the middle from stagnating." Mara understood the principle, even as her hands kept moving, wrapping the child tighter, checking the old man's pulse, giving the weaver woman a cup of warm water. Air needed a path the way people did. Outside, twilight deepened, and with it, the sound of footsteps multiplied. The weaver family's arrival had been seen. In a small settlement, suffering travelled faster than rumour. A knock, then another, then voices, 2 men, a woman, someone older wheezing. Ellis froze, staring at the door as if it were a dam holding back a flood. "Mara," he said quietly, "if we open again—" "We have rules," Mara cut in, surprising herself with the hardness of her tone. "We set them now, or we drown in mercy." Ellis swallowed. He respected rules. Rules kept machines from tearing hands off. Mara opened the door a crack and faced the night. Shapes crowded the dark, bundled figures, faces pale, eyes desperate. Caldero stood among them, no longer loud. "Holt says you'll help," he said, voice small. Mara felt anger spark. "Holt doesn't decide what we do," she snapped. Then, controlling herself, she raised her voice so all could hear. "One at a time, sick first, children first, no weapons inside, no shouting. If you can work, you work. If you can't, you rest." A murmur ran through the group, relief tangled with resentment at being commanded by the woman they'd mocked. Ellis leaned close to her ear. "If the wheel stops tonight," he whispered, "we lose the generator and the mill." "Then we keep it turning," Mara whispered back. "We cut the ice channel at dawn. We don't let the river quit." He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the same fear she felt, not of cold, but of responsibility. Mara opened the door wider. The first of them stepped into the cave's dim red glow and stared at the stone walls as if they'd walked into a different world. Someone whispered, "It's warm." Mara didn't correct them. Warm was relative. Warm was hope. Warm was dangerous because it made people stop thinking. Outside, the river groaned under its tightening skin, and the wheel's rhythm slowed again. Thump, splash, pause. Mara heard it like a countdown. They had hours, maybe, before the current choked and their whole system went dark. And now, they weren't building for 2. They were building for a town. By midnight, the cave held 13 people, and the air had changed. Not dangerous. Ellis kept testing draft with a smoking splint, watching the thin ribbon of smoke tilt toward the flue, but heavy, wet with breath and wool and fear. Condensation gathered on the colder ceiling stones and fell in slow drops that sounded like a clock. Mara hated that sound. Drip, drip. It meant the cave was taking on water from the inside. "We're fogging it," Ellis murmured, voice tight. He pointed to the slick sheen on the wall. "Moisture will soak bedding. Then we're not warm. We're damp." The weaver child slept fitfully, cheeks finally pinking. The old man lay propped against the stone, eyes half closed, each breath a shallow scrape. Around them, townsfolk huddled in awkward silence, not sure if they were guests or prisoners. Mara stood in the middle of it all, feeling the weight of every inhale. "We need to wring the air out," she said. Ellis nodded, already moving. He took 2 planks and a handful of nails and built a baffle near the stove, a simple vertical board that forced rising warm air to travel along the ceiling toward the back before it could drop. "Keeps the hot layer from short-circuiting straight to the flue," he said, hammering fast. "More heat stays in the room." A woman named Tessa, who'd once laughed loudest at river rats, watched him with wide eyes. "You can just make the air go where you want," she whispered. Ellis didn't look up. "Air goes where pressure tells it," he said. "Same as people." Mara seized the opening. "If you can work, come here," she called. "We're making a drying rack, high, near the warm layer." 2 men hesitated, unused to taking orders from her, then stepped forward. Mara handed them cord and showed them how to string it tight between posts. Soon damp mittens and socks hung above the stove, steam rising off them in ghostly strands. Outside, the wind rose into a long, brutal howl. Snow began to hit the door in bursts, like handfuls of gravel. The sound made people flinch. A child whimpered. Mara touched the child's shoulder and felt the tremor of panic under the blanket. Then the wheel outside changed its voice. The steady slap became an irregular grind. The chain rattled. Something knocked, hollow and wrong, like a bone striking wood. Ellis froze, listening. "Ice jam," he said. Mara's mouth went dry. If the wheel stopped, the generator would stop. Their red filament light would die. The mill would halt. And worse, the wheel was their proof, their argument. Without it, they were just another shelter with a stove. Ellis grabbed his coat. "I need to clear it." Mara caught his sleeve. "You go out there now, and you'll lose feeling in minutes," she hissed. The wind sounded murderous. Ellis's eyes were fierce. "If I don't, we lose the wheel by morning. Ice will lock it solid. It'll tear paddles off." Mara let go because she knew he was right, but she didn't let him go alone. She turned to the group. "Cal," she said sharply, "you and the other strong ones, 2 of you, come. Everyone else stays put. No one opens the door." Cal's face tightened. He wasn't used to being recruited as labor by the people he'd mocked, but he nodded. "All right," he said, voice subdued. They unbarred the door together. Cold punched in so hard it stole breath. Snow swirled in the crack like white smoke. The wheel's silhouette loomed, half hidden by ice glare. Ellis led them down, lantern hooded to keep it from blowing out. The river's tongue of open water had narrowed. Ice plates pressed against the wheel frame, wedging between paddles. Each rotation fought, grinding ice into splinters. Ellis shouted over the wind, "We need a channel, not tomorrow, now!" Cal stared at him. "With what? It's solid." "With steel," Mara snapped, and thrust an ice chisel into his hands, one of Ellis's forged tools, heavy and sharp. "Hit the seam, not the middle. Crack it where it wants to crack." They worked like men digging someone out of a collapse. Chisel, strike, pry. Ice broke in slabs, the sound loud as gunshots. Mara's arms burned. Cal's breath came in harsh bursts. Another man, Jory, a farmer, split his glove and kept striking anyway, blood spotting the snow. Ellis crawled onto the wheel frame, bracing himself with one arm while he hacked ice free from the axle housing. "If the bearings freeze," he shouted, "it's done." Mara saw the river trying to take their machine back, patient and relentless. Each time they cleared the paddles, new ice drifted in. The wind shoved it like a hand. "Make a gate," Mara yelled suddenly, seeing the shape of a solution. Upstream, 2 logs angled, pushed the plates away from the wheel. Ellis looked at her, comprehension flashing. "Deflector booms," he yelled. "Yes." They dragged 2 logs from the bank, heavy with frozen bark, and jammed them into the gravel upstream at a wide V-shape pointing toward the wheel. Cal and Jory held the ends, while Mara packed stones around the bases. The current caught the first ice plate, slid it along the angled log, and shunted it sideways, away from the wheel. For a moment, the river seemed to cooperate, sending its ice away like unwanted guests. The wheel's rhythm steadied. Thump, splash, thump. Ellis dropped down, chest heaving. His eyebrows were crusted white. "It'll buy us time," he said. "Not forever." Mara's fingers had gone numb. She couldn't feel the chisel handle. That scared her more than pain. Numbness meant you didn't know you were breaking. "Back inside," she ordered, and no one argued. They slammed the door shut behind them, sealing wind out. The cave stored warmth wrapped around them like a blanket, and the townsfolk stared at the 3 of them as if they'd returned from a battlefield. The filament lamp still glowed faintly red, proof that the wheel still turned. But Mara heard the storm settling in, pressing snow against their vent outlet, piling drifts against the door, changing the world outside faster than any man could cut his way through. Ellis looked at the ceiling where condensation still gathered. "If the vent gets buried," he said quietly, "smoke will back up." Mara stared at the door, imagining it sealed under snow, imagining people trapped inside with a stove they couldn't safely use. The cave had saved them from cold. Now it threatened to become a tomb if they didn't outthink the storm. The storm didn't end by morning. It deepened. Wind hammered the river flats until the snow stopped looking like flakes and started looking like sand, driven sideways, relentless, finding every seam. The cave door bowed slightly under pressure, canvas skin thrumming. Somewhere outside, a tree cracked with a sound like a rifle shot. Mara woke to coughing, not the dry cough of cold air, but the thick, irritated cough of smoke that wasn't leaving fast enough. Ellis was already on his knees by the stove, eyes narrowed, holding a smoking splint near the flue opening. The smoke didn't stream upward the way it should. It curled, hesitated, and sank. "Draft's failing," he said, voice flat with fear. Mara's mind flashed to the vent outlet above the back fissure, now likely buried under a drift. If snow sealed the exhaust, the cave would fill slowly with poison. People would get sleepy. They'd lie down. They'd never get up. How many minutes? She didn't know, and not knowing made it worse. "Everyone up," Mara snapped, loud enough to cut through grogginess. "No one lies down. Children on the bedding, adults on their feet." Groans and mutters rose. Tessa blinked, confused. Cal sat up, rubbing his face. The weaver woman clutched her child tighter. Ellis grabbed Mara's wrist. "We need to clear the outlet," he said, "or make a new one." "In this wind?" Mara said. Her voice sounded harsh even to her. Ellis didn't answer, because there was no good answer. He just looked at the stove, like it was a loaded gun pointed at their lungs. Mara forced herself to think like Ellis thought. Options, constraints, failure modes. If they opened the door wide, they'd get fresh air, but they'd also invite a blast of snow that could bury bedding and freeze fingers. If they stopped the stove entirely, the cave would cool, but slowly. The thermal mass would buy time. If they could keep the wheel turning, they'd have light even without fire, but light didn't warm lungs. "Kill the fire," Mara decided. "Now!" Ellis's eyes widened. Then he obeyed instantly. He shut the damper, scooped ash over the coals, and slammed the stove door. The glow died. Smoke thinned, but the cave still held the stink of what had already leaked. Mara turned to Cal and Jory. "You two," she said. "You're going out with Ellis. Rope yourselves to the doorframe. If you let go, the storm takes you." Cal stared. "Out there? You said—" "I said no one opens the door unless it's life," Mara cut in. "This is life." Ellis pulled a coil of rope from the wall and looped it around their waists, knotting fast with numb fingers. He handed Mara the other end. "Anchor it," he said. Mara wrapped it around a rock post twice and tied it off. Her hands shook, but the knot held. Ellis took the lantern and swung the door open. The wind punched into the cave like a beast. Snow exploded inward, blasting faces, snuffing small sounds. People cried out. Mara threw herself against the door edge, using her body as a shield to keep it from ripping free. Ellis, Cal, and Jory vanished into white. For long seconds the rope stayed slack. Mara's heart hammered so hard she tasted blood. Then the line snapped tight, jerking her forward. They'd found their footing. They were climbing. Minutes stretched. The cave filled with cold, but not death. People huddled, eyes fixed on the rope, as if it were the only thing connecting them to air. A shout faintly carried through the storm. Ellis's voice, thin and torn by wind. "It's sealed," Mara shouted back. "Clear it. Dig down to rock." She felt the rope vibrate with their effort, the tremor travelling into her hands. She imagined them above, crawling along the cliff face to the vent outlet, digging through drifted snow with mittened hands, trying not to slip. Then the rope went slack again. Mara's stomach dropped. "Ellis!" she yelled. A beat of silence, and then the line tightened hard, nearly pulling her off balance. They were alive, still working. Inside, the old man wheezed, eyes half closed. Mara forced him to sip water. "Stay awake," she told him, voice softer now. "You hear me? Don't let the dark win." Finally, after what felt like an hour, but was probably 10 brutal minutes, the air in the cave shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, a faint pulling sensation against Mara's cheek, as if the cave had exhaled. The lingering smoke smell began to lift, drawn upward instead of settling. Ellis stumbled back through the door first, face raw, eyelashes caked white. Cal and Jory followed, shoulders hunched, breathing like bellows. They slammed the door shut, and the sudden quiet rang in everyone's ears. Ellis dropped to his knees. "We dug it clear," he rasped, "and we built a little hood, stones stacked over the outlet. Snow slides off. Should hold." Mara crouched beside him, gripping his shoulders. "You did it," she said, but her voice cracked on the words. She wasn't praising him. She was thanking him for keeping the cave from becoming a coffin. The townsfolk stared at Ellis, as if seeing him for the first time, not as a fool in a river hole, but as the man who'd just pulled air back into their lungs. Cal sat with his back against the wall, shaking. "Reverend Holt was wrong," he said hoarsely, speaking into the dim. "This ain't witch work. It's sense." Tessa wiped her eyes with a sleeve. "We laughed," she whispered. "We all laughed." Mara felt anger flare, then fade, replaced by something heavier. Laughter didn't matter anymore. Survival did. Ellis pushed himself upright, wincing at his bruised knuckles. He looked around the cave, at damp clothes steaming on racks, at the red filament lamp still glowing because the wheel still turned, at the frightened faces waiting for instruction. "Listen," he said, voice steadier now. "We can't run the stove hard while the storm piles snow. We'll burn small, only to charge the stones when draft is clear. We'll grind in shifts. We'll melt snow near the intake so the air stays drier. And if you stay, if you take shelter here, you work." No one argued, not even Reverend Holt, who stood near the back, coat dusted with snow, eyes lowered. He'd come during the night, Mara realized. He'd come because righteousness didn't keep you warm. Outside, the storm kept raging, but inside the cave, the system, wheel, vent, stone, had passed its trial by catastrophe, and the settlement's mockery had finally run out, replaced by a new currency, Respect paid in silence. 3 days later, the storm loosened its fist. Not gently. Winter never did anything gently, but enough that the sky showed pale blue between ragged clouds, and the wind dropped from a howl to a hard, steady breath. Snowdrifts still stood like walls, and the river still wore ice, but the world had edges again. The first thing Mara did was walk outside alone. She needed space where no one watched her face. Inside the cave, she'd been leader, guard, nurse, and judge. Outside, she could be a woman who trembled when the fear finally caught up. The wheel turned slower now, but it turned. The V-shaped ice deflectors Ellis and the others had jammed upstream were scarred and glazed, but they still shoved plates aside. Each slap of water sounded like a hammer striking a nail. Proof, proof, proof. Ellis joined her, boots crunching. He looked older than he had 2 weeks ago. Responsibility did that. "Town's in pieces," he said quietly. Mara stared toward the settlement. Smoke rose thinly from only a few chimneys. Some cabins sat dark, their doors drifted half shut. Fences were missing sections, burned. A cart lay on its side where someone had tried to haul wood in the storm and failed. "How many?" Mara asked. Ellis hesitated. "No deaths," he said at last. "Not from cold. 2 from sickness that started before the storm. But there are frostbitten hands, burned scars from desperate stoves. People scared." Mara closed her eyes, letting that sink in. No deaths. Their cave had been crowded, tense, miserable at times, but it had held. Behind them, the cave door opened, and Cal Darrow stepped out, hat in his hands. He looked as if he'd rehearsed words and hated every one of them. Mara waited. She didn't help him. Cal cleared his throat. "I owe you," he said. The sentence came out rough, as if it scraped on pride. "I said things. In the mercantile. By the stove. I made it sport." Ellis's gaze stayed steady. "Sport's cheap when you're warm," he replied. Cal nodded once, swallowing. "My boy's cough's gone," he said, "because you kept him dry, because you kept the smoke moving." He glanced at the wheel, then at the cliff face. "People want to know how." Mara's shoulders tightened. The request carried weight. "Teach us, and you become responsible for what we build. Refuse us, and you become the villain in the story they'll tell to justify their failure." Ellis looked to Mara, letting her decide. That was new too. Ellis had always been the builder, but the crisis had made Mara the one who could hold a crowd. "We don't give out secrets," Mara said, voice calm. "There aren't any. We give out work." Cal blinked. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Mara continued, "if the town wants to stop freezing every winter, you don't copy our cave and call it done. You learn the principles. Drainage, controlled draft, stored heat, and you build with your own hands so you understand what fails." Cal nodded slowly, as if relief and shame mixed together. "Holt wants a meeting," he said, "at the chapel. Says you should speak." Mara almost laughed. The chapel had been where people whispered that living under earth was shameful. Now they wanted the Riverbank woman to teach them how to breathe. That afternoon, Mara and Ellis walked into the chapel, with snow still clinging to their boots. The room smelled of wet wool and cold wood, because the stove there burned low to conserve fuel. Faces turned toward them, familiar and different at once. Less certain, more honest. Reverend Holt stood at the front, hands folded. He didn't begin with prayer. He began with a statement that cost him something. "I judged what I didn't understand," he said, voice carrying, "and I spoke fear as if it were faith." A murmur ran through the benches. Mara watched the congregation's reaction, some surprised, some vindicated, some uneasy. Holt's confession opened a space where others could admit their own mistakes. He turned to Mara and Ellis. "Tell us," he said, "what kept you alive?" Ellis started to answer like an engineer. Mara touched his sleeve, just enough to slow him. not silence him. First, Mara said, we stopped treating wood like it was endless. People shifted, as if struck. Second, she continued, we treated heat like something you can store. Thick walls, stone, earth, anything with mass, hold warmth longer than thin boards. But mass alone won't save you if you choke on smoke. Ellis picked up the thread. Draft must be controlled, he said. Fresh air comes in low, near the fire. Smoke goes out high. If your outlet gets buried, you die. So you protect the outlet. Build a hood. Keep a rod handy to clear it from inside if you can. A man raised a hand. What about caves? He asked, suspicion still clinging. We can't all live in rock. You don't need caves, Mara said. You need the idea. Berm your cabins with earth on the north side. Stack stone behind your stove. Build a porch wall that blocks wind. Dig a root cellar that stays above flood marks and below frost line. You don't need to be underground. You need to stop letting wind steal everything you make. Ellis added, and if you can take work from moving water, wheel, treadle, even a simple hand crank, you save your muscles for emergencies. The meeting turned into questions, then into plans, then into a kind of collective urgency. Men who'd mocked Ellis asked how to carve a pulley. Women who'd called Mara filthy asked how to seal a door frame with clay and moss. Someone volunteered to cut timber for communal deflectors on the river, to keep ice from jamming future wheels. No one laughed, not once. In the weeks that followed, the Riverbank cave became something stranger than a refuge, a classroom. People came in daylight, not at midnight, and Ellis made them put hands on tools. Mara made them measure, mark, and test with water in a cup the way she had, because she wanted them to feel how small errors became disasters. When the first modified cabin in town held 6C6C warmer overnight with half the wood, word spread beyond the flats. A trapper carried the story upriver. A surveyor wrote it down in a ledger as a notable improvement in winter habitation. By late season, the settlement council, newly formed in the aftermath, nailed a plank sign near the river trail. Riverbank works, build for wind, build for draft, store heat, share skill. Mara stood before that sign one evening, watching children run past it, without understanding how close their toes had come to turning black. Ellis stood beside her, hands in his pockets, listening to the wheel. They'll forget the laughter, Ellis said. Mara shook her head. No, she replied. They'll remember it, and that's good, because next time someone builds different, the memory might keep them from mocking first and thinking later. Ellis looked at the cave mouth, no longer a mouth, but a doorway that had changed a town's habits. We weren't trying to be examples, he said. Mara watched smoke rise from the settlement now, thinner, cleaner, less desperate. No, she said, we were trying to survive. The wheels slapped the river in its steady rhythm, and the stone behind them held the day's warmth for the coming night. Winter still owned the land, but it no longer owned their choices.